Near the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And so as you look on the screen there, Nebuchadnezzar is going to die in 562. It doesn't say how long the period of time is between when he got his sanity back and when he died, but it does indicate that he reigned for a while between that. So, he probably reigned at least a couple years before he died. And so the events of what we're going to look at now in chapter 5, so he dies in 562. This in chapter 5 is going to be in 539. So this is 23 years later. And let me kind of explain a little bit of these characters and what's going on. So Nebuchadnezzar is going to die, and he's really the only strong king in the history of Babylon. You've got a bunch of weak kings that come after that. His son is decent, but he doesn't reign very long before he gets assassinated in 560. So he only rules for 2 years until he gets assassinated. So then Neriglissar reigns for 4 years, and then he dies, and then his son reigns for 3 months, and then he gets assassinated. So then the last two kings are Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Nabonidus, talked about this for a while last week. So he's going to technically reign for 17 years, but he's kind of an absentee king. He wants to worship a different god than they worship in the city of Babylon, and so he leaves Babylon off and on, but for a lot of those 17 years, he's not present. He's a long way away in Arabia, where he can worship the moon god called Sin. And so his son is a co-regent or reigns when his dad is out of town most of the time. And so his name is Belshazzar, okay? What's going to happen in this chapter is it's going to get confusing if I don't explain this. So it's going to say over and over again that Belshazzar is the son of not Nabonidus, but Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And so there's a couple of possibilities for what that means. A lot of times in the Old Testament, the word son of can just mean a descendant of. It's not your literal son. And so what that means is he's in the line of Nebuchadnezzar, and so it could be one of a couple things. He could be Nebuchadnezzar's literal son, meaning that he was a son of Nebuchadnezzar, and then after Nebuchadnezzar dies, Nabonidus adopted him. That's a possibility. The other possibility is he is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and Nabonidus married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, and so Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Those are the two most likely scenarios. So that term's going to keep popping up in this chapter. So just kind of keep that in mind. He could be Nebuchadnezzar's son and the adopted son of Nabonidus, or he may be Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. We don't really know which. Okay, so then a couple other things to kind of explain. So Nabonidus, he is going to be king, but when Nebuchadnezzar was king, he was one of the officials in Nebuchadnezzar's administration. So when Belshazzar was young, he was living in the city. And so he would have seen the events that happened to Nebuchadnezzar, where Nebuchadnezzar lost his sanity for a period of time. So he would have been aware of all that. We don't know exactly how old he is, but in the reign of Neriglissar that you see on the bottom of the screen, during Neriglissar's reign, he is one of the officials in Neriglissar's administration. So he's old enough, around 560 or so, to be an administrator in the government. So he would have, in the 560s, late 570s, when Nebuchadnezzar was king, he would have been old enough to know what's going on, okay? And that's relevant too once you get into the chapter. I think that was the main stuff I wanted to kind of show you off this. Now, as far as the background for the chapter, so chapter 4 is late in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Daniel's about 50 years old in chapter 4. Chapter 8 or actually mid-50s, something like that. Chapter 5 is 23 years later after Nebuchadnezzar dies, okay? So Daniel is going to be about 80 years old at this point. Now, it doesn't say in the chapter what role Daniel is playing. A lot of people assume that what happened was when Nebuchadnezzar dies and then his son becomes king, Daniel may have still been in the administration, but once Nebuchadnezzar's son is assassinated, usually what was happening is they would turn over the administration and bring in new people. And so Daniel may have retired or been kind of forced out of the administration at that point, or he may have just been assigned to a lesser role. So when we start reading this chapter, it doesn't seem like Belshazzar knows who Daniel is, or at least isn't very familiar with who he is. So he's obviously doesn't have a prominent role in his administration, at least, by the time you get to that point. So what's happening in chapter 5? This is the very last night of the Babylonian Empire. So what has happened leading up to this is Nabonidus. So you essentially have two kings right now. You have Nabonidus the father and Belshazzar the son, and they're reigning together. Nabonidus is usually out of the city. He's not really part of the administration, but he has come back because what has happened is Persia, the Medes and the Persians are fighting against Babylon. And so he comes back and he leads Babylon in a battle against the Medes and Persians, not too far away from the capital city of Babylon. And he loses that battle. And so he ends up fleeing the city to try to get away. And so at the point of the events of chapter 5, Belshazzar is the only one in the city at that point that's ruling. And the Medes and Persians have taken all of Babylon except for the capital city. So they have taken the whole nation. The capital city is surrounded by the Medes and the Persians. And but the thing is the city is pretty difficult to capture, or so they think, because of the double-walled structure that we talked about last week. So there's multiple walls around the city. The city is very large. It has a really good water supply. The river runs right through the middle of the city, and they had stockpiled a lot of food. So they thought they could survive several years of a siege and be just fine without any difficulty or anything like that. I might briefly tell you what happens. I may end up having to tell you the rest of it next week, but it might be better to tell it at the end of the chapter than at the beginning. But yeah, I'll just save it for the end. But this is the last night of the reign, or the Babylonian Empire, and so the actual date for this, the events of the chapter that we're going to read here is October 11th, 539 BC, and then. So that's the evening, and then the next morning is when the actual city will fall completely, and Belshazzar will get killed the next morning on October 12th, 539 BC. I just had a thought that I was going to tell you, and it left already. Okay, maybe it'll come back to it in a minute. All right, so what's happening on this last night here is, what we're going to read about is a celebration that they're going to have. And the reason for the celebration may be one of three things. One, it may be that Belshazzar is being crowned king in total because his father has left the city and fled, and so they may be crowning him king as not as a co-regent, but as officially the only king at this point. That part seems a bit unlikely based on some things that are said in a little bit later in the chapter. It may be that it's just a celebration of an annual feast that they normally have. And that one might be correct because it seems the Medes and Persians know that the people are going to be distracted on this particular night based on the way they decide to attack the city, which we'll talk about later. The one thing I remember now what I was going to tell you. So this is the last night of the Babylonian Empire. Nabonidus was not a popular king because he was gone most of the time and the people didn't like him. They didn't really like Belshazzar that much either. So actually what ends up happening is when the Medes and Persians come in, the people are actually kind of excited about it, and so they don't really fight against them. They just kind of let them walk in and take it over. And so there isn't really a battle at all, so to speak. So with that in mind, we'll start the chapter, and I'll kind of explain some more stuff as we go along. But again, this is the very last night of the Babylonian Empire. All right, so verse 1, it says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. So let me kind of stop and make a couple comments here. So where scholars think this is at, so the king had 3 palaces in the city, but the south palace was the larger one, and that one had a very large throne room. I forget the exact dimensions. It's like 150 by 50 feet. I don't know what the size of this room is, but we'll just say it's about the size of this room. So obviously it's large enough you can get 1,000 people in it. And it had 3 doors, kind of like the back here, and no windows, okay? So it's kind of reminiscent of the size of this room. And so this is likely where the scene is. So archaeologists have found this palace, they found this throne room, and they think it's the same room as this that we're reading about here. And so a couple other things to point out. So when a king would throw a banquet like this, the king didn't actually normally show up with the guests, so the fact that he's there is a little bit unusual. And then when it gets to the part it says that he drank wine in the presence of the 1,000, that also is not common, but the word drink there does not mean that he just tasted it. He's on the way to getting drunk is what it means. And so obviously bad decisions are about to start being made here. All right, chapter 2, it says, while he tasted the wine, and that also doesn't mean tasted, it means he's well on his way to being inebriated. Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Okay, several things to point out here. One, so he's on his way to being drunk, and he issues this rather foolish command to bring these silver and gold vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had brought from the temple. Now, he may have asked for other religious artifacts to be brought in too, because remember, they captured a bunch of different countries, and they would take the artifacts from those countries and bring them back. And so it may not just be the ones from Judah that they brought in, but Daniel would only be concerned about the ones from Judah, so that's the one Daniel records. But it's important to know that even in that culture throughout the ancient Near East, this is taboo. You do not do this, okay? Everybody in attendance at this banquet knows this is something you don't do. You do not mess with religious artifacts, even from other countries, okay? And so this is a huge no-no, and he knows good and well it's a no-no. So what had happened, Nebuchadnezzar took these artifacts in the 605 siege of the city. So this is they've been in Babylon for about 50 years, these gold vessels and silver vessels. But when Nebuchadnezzar got them, he just brought them and put them in the treasury of one of the temples there in Babylon. And they just sat there for 50 years. You don't get them out and mess around with them like Belshazzar's doing, okay? So everybody knows this is wrong. You don't do this. So why is he doing this? Well, this is probably political propaganda, okay? And so what do I mean by that? The city is surrounded by the Medes and the Persians. What he is saying is, I am strong enough as your king to save you. Our gods are strong enough to save you, and Yahweh ain't going to do anything about it, okay? This is a political message that he's pushing out to his people, okay? So it's a rallying cry, so to speak, to all the political rulers there that are in the banquet hall, that everything's going to be fine, I'm your king, everything's going to be good, our gods are going to take care of us, the Medes and Persians aren't going to come in the city, everything's fine, okay? And so that's kind of the message here. Now, the other thing to notice is it's not just men present here. It's his wives, his concubines, etc. And so a lot of scholars think that this is not just a political banquet. The fact that they have all the alcohol there and the women, this is intended to be an orgy, okay? Normally the women did not show up to this kind of thing, and so for them to be there, has to be a reason for it. And so a lot of people think that this is basically intended to be a wild, hedonistic party when the city is surrounded by the enemy, okay? And so that's kind of the picture that we're seeing here. All right, so verse 3, it says, "Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone." So they end up drinking from the vessels, and in the processes, they're praising their own God, okay? So the gods that they're probably praising, there's 4 main gods that they're probably referring to. So the first one is Marduk or Baal, same god. And that's the patron god of the city, and that's the one that Belshazzar is named after. Then there's Nabu, which is in Nebuchadnezzar's name. Nabu is the god of wisdom, literature, and education. And then you have 2 other god, or 1 god and 1 goddess. There's Nergal, who's the god of war, and then there's Ishtar, who's the goddess of fertility. So these are probably the 4 that it's referencing when it talks about these gods of silver, gold, wood, etc. So what is happening, though, here in the process is Belshazzar and the people at the party, they're blaspheming Yahweh, okay? And they're intentionally doing it. That's the whole reason to bring in the artifacts from the temple in Jerusalem, is you're desecrating them, you're blaspheming that God, you're making fun of that God, and you're saying in the process, I'm stronger than Yahweh, our gods are stronger than Yahweh, we're going to be just fine, okay? And so that's what he's doing in the process here. All right, so verse 5, it says, "In the same hour," other translations say immediately. It says, "The fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace." And then it says, "And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote." Okay, so what is happening here is, say the room is about this size, and there's no windows and there's 3 doors, is the way it's been discovered by archaeologists. So this event is happening right by the lampstand, so everybody in the room can see exactly what is going on. And what happens is they have found that the walls in that room were plastered white, okay? So it's a white wall with a lampstand beside it so that you can see exactly what's being written on the wall. And so this hand mysteriously appears. Why a hand? Why would God do it that way? Well, in ancient Near Eastern culture, when you would have a battle, they would cut off the hands of the deceased soldiers and throw them into a pile, and you would know how many people that died based on how many hands you threw into the pile, okay? That was their way of counting the victims. And so what is happening is God is showing a hand to say, I'm not dead yet. Okay, you thought you killed me when you conquered Judah, but you didn't. I allowed that to happen. I'm still very much alive, and I'm about to give you a message, okay? So you can imagine that might create a bit of terror in you if you're the host of the party here. And so verse 6, it says, "Then the king's countenance changed." The idea is that he became like a white as a ghost, or, all the blood rushed out of his head. We have a lot of euphemisms for that. Some other translations say the appearance of his face changed. His thoughts troubled him. Yeah, I could see that. So that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. To quote the wise old sage Scooby-Doo, this is a rut-row moment, okay? we might say he wet his pants, might be more of an English euphemism for what he is doing here. He's terrified. He knows this is a major problem, okay? This is obviously a divine intervention that is creating this message on the wall. And so he is basically starting to panic. And so you see that in the next verse. It says the king cried out. That's a bad translation. He is freaking out, okay? And he's screaming is really what it's saying. He is screaming for these guys to come in. He's terrified at what he has just seen. So it says the king screamed, if you want to use that, screamed to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple. That means they would become, royal or important. Have a chain of gold around their neck. So later in Persian society, which is going to take over here in less than 12 hours from this event. So if you assume that it's the same in Babylonian as it was in Persian, the only people who could wear a gold chain around their neck is if the king actually presented it to them, okay? So anybody that had a gold chain around their neck was someone of great importance. And then it says, and they shall be third ruler in the kingdom. Why the third? Probably his father, Nabonidus, would still be one, and he would be two. And then whoever does this would become three, okay? So that's the thought with that. It says in verse 8, now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. Okay, a couple things about the reading. It could mean several things. I meant to make a slide for this, but I ran out of time. So you can actually read the words if you look at verse 25. Those are the words that are written on the wall. So why could they not read this? Well, there's several reasons for it. When it says they couldn't read it, does that literally mean they couldn't read it or they didn't know what it meant? And probably the latter. So this would be written in Aramaic. The issue with Old Semitic languages is there are no vowels in them. So you would just have the consonants. So if you look at those words in verse 25, the way it would literally show up would be M-N, M-N, T-K-L. Depending on what translation you're in, the last word is spelled different. If I just go with the New King James. The PH is a single letter, and then R-S-N, okay? But the problem is all those letters would be combined together. There's no space between the words. So you're trying to figure out, when you look at it, you can make a lot of words out of those, 10 consonants, if you want, with no vowels in between. So they may not actually be able to read it, even though they read Aramaic, because you're trying to sit there and figure out which vowels do I want to put in here, what sounds do I want to create, which words would that be. Just think about the letters RD. How many different words can you make with RD if you stick in some different vowels? Red, road, rod, reed, etc. You can make a bunch of them. And so that's the same issue here when you're looking at these words. They're looking at it and they can read Aramaic, but it's like, what is that? Okay, so you're taking a while to figure out when they're all jumbled together like that. What are these words? And even if you figured out the words, then the question is, well, what is the significance of this? What does it mean? Okay, so it may be that they could read it and they just didn't know exactly what it stood for or what the significance of it was. Okay, verse 10, it says the queen. Now let me stop and talk about who this is. Okay, is this Belshazzar's wife? And the answer is no. Okay, and how do I know that? His wife is already mentioned in verse 2, okay, because it says his wives and concubines are already at the party, okay? So who is this person? This is likely what's called the Queen Mother. So in ancient Near Eastern societies, the Queen Mother had a ton of power. And so it would be the mother of the king. So for instance, if you go back to the story of Solomon, so everybody knows Solomon's mother is Bathsheba. But if you go back to that story, before Solomon is made king, Adonijah tries to do a coup and become king in his place. And so Bathsheba, at the urging of the prophet, says, hey, you better go talk to David, where Adonijah is going to become king. And if Adonijah becomes king, what do you think is going to happen to you and your son? You're going to get killed, okay? And so Bathsheba is like, uh-oh, we can't have that happen. So she goes to David and says, hey, I thought you were going to make my son king. Why is Adonijah saying he's king? And so David says, okay, you know, he didn't know about Adonijah and what Adonijah was doing. So he's like, okay, I will make Solomon king. And so they crown Solomon king. Well, after Solomon becomes king, Adonijah kind of freaks out, and he's like, uh-oh, you know, I started this coup, now I'm not king, so my brother, half-brother, is going to kill me because of this. So he goes to the tabernacle, puts his hands on the horn of the altar so that he won't be killed. Solomon basically tells him, okay, if you're a good boy and don't cause any problems, I won't kill you. But what happens is Adonijah comes to Bathsheba later and he says, hey, I really like one of David's concubines. She's pretty good looking. Why don't you give her to me to be wife? Well, that is considered an assault on the king because you're trying to take, so Solomon inherits the harem from his father, and so these are now his wives and concubines. And so for Adonijah to ask for one of his concubines is to make an attempt towards the throne. And so Bathsheba, he asked Bathsheba for this, and Bathsheba goes to Solomon and says, hey, your half-brother just asked for a concubine of yours. Yeah, we need to get rid of him. And he gets killed for it because she told Solomon to kill him. So the Queen Mother has a lot of power in the ancient Near East, and that's who this is. Well, so who is she? Well, it depends on who you think Belshazzar's father is. If Belshazzar's father is Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus just adopted Belshazzar, then this woman would be his actual mother, who was the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. If you think Nabonidus married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter and Nebuchadnezzar is Belshazzar's grandfather, then this woman would be Belshazzar's grandmother. Okay, so it's either his mother or his grandmother, depending on what you think the relationship to Nebuchadnezzar is. Okay. Anyway, regardless, she is very influential and powerful. All right, so she's not at the party originally, and so here we are in verse 10, and she's going to stroll in because she kind of heard what's going on. Okay. So verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. That's just a common greeting they say to the king to suck up to him. So it says, do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God, and I don't know why the New King James capitalized Spirit, because it doesn't need to be. But what the phrase means is this guy, Daniel, has a connection to the gods. And it should be God plural, not holy God, but anyway. It should say Spirit of the gods, which is what a lot of other translations say. And so what she's saying is this guy, he has a connection to the gods. He can, he somehow communicates with them, and he can figure out stuff that nobody else can figure out. Why would she know that? because she's probably Nebuchadnezzar's wife, and she saw this happen before, okay? And so midway through verse 11. And in the days of your father, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, light and understanding of wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So you can kind of gather from that, Daniel's not in any kind of significant role now, if a role at all. He may just be retired and out of public life, and nobody really knows much about him anymore. But she knows who he is. And notice she's using his Hebrew name. She's not calling him Belteshazzar. She's calling him Daniel, okay? Which means she probably knew him personally, because remember, Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel seem to be almost friends, the way they interact with each other. So she would have known Daniel and would have interacted with him at some point as well. So as you keep going, verse 12, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. So she gives a lot of, flowery language about him and about how good he is at what he does. But really the gist of it is she's saying this guy has a communication or a connection to the gods. He's able to figure out these kind of problems. He's done it multiple times in the past for Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar had put him in charge of all these magicians and soothsayers, all these clowns you just called in here that can't do anything. He was over all those guys at one time. And so if you call him, he can figure this out. Now there is one, if I can find it. So in verse 11, she says, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. It should be spirit of the holy gods, but the key thing is she says the word holy. And we're going to notice how Belshazzar basically repeats this language, but he leaves out that one important word. He doesn't use the word holy. He drops it. All right, so verse 13. Now, we don't know where Daniel was. I mean, he's somewhere in the city, but who knows where he is in relation to the palace and the events happening that night. So they may have to send out an Uber to get him. So who knows how long in between, this conversation and Daniel showing up. But anyway, verse 13, Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel? Now notice he uses his Hebrew name too, but he may be doing it for a couple of reasons. One, notice that Belteshazzar, which is Daniel, and Belshazzar sound a lot alike. And so he may be doing it to differentiate the two people so the names don't get messed up. But he also may be doing it to point out that he's a Jew, which he is going to point out here in a second. So he says, are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah? So he's asking the question, are you a Jew? Are you from Judah? Which honestly is kind of irrelevant, except for the fact, which God did he just blaspheme? He blasphemed the God of the Jews, okay? And so it is relevant from that standpoint. And it says, who my father the king brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you. Now, I don't know if he had ever heard of him before the Queen Mother just told him all this, but at least he knows of him now from her. And it says, I've heard of you that the Spirit of God, again, it should be the Spirit of the gods, but notice he drops the word holy from it, okay? Why would he drop the word holy? He's probably scared, okay? He knows he just blasphemed Yahweh, and he did it on purpose. He knew he did it. And what is the punishment for blaspheming a God? It's death, okay? Why do you think he wet his pants when he saw the handwriting on the wall? He knows what that means. He knows he's supposed to die for this, okay? That's why he's freaking out. And so he drops the word holy here because he's terrified. And so he says, I've heard that the Spirit of God is in you and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. He's basically rehashing all the stuff the Queen Mother said. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretation and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, what we don't know at this point in Daniel is Daniel has actually already made a prophecy that the Medes and Persians are going to come in and destroy Babylon. You don't see that, I think, until chapter 8, but he's actually already prophesied this. Daniel knows what's going on. Like, he knows this is not going to end well. And so all these gifts and stuff the king's promising to him, it's garbage. I mean, this isn't going to mean anything in less than 12 hours because Babylon isn't going to exist in less than 12 hours. All right, so verse 17, it says, Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let your gifts be for yourself. Now, he's not being rude here. What he is actually saying is, you can't buy Yahweh. Your junk that you want to offer me isn't going to change. One, it's not going to change the interpretation I'm going to give you. And two, you can't buy Yahweh off. So you just blasphemed to God. The God has appeared before you. The punishment for blasphemy is death. You offering me these trinkets isn't going to get you out of the punishment that's coming your way. Okay? So he says, Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. So it says, O king, the most high God. So what he's going to do now is he's going to recount what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? Now the whole point of this recount is, if Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest man in all the world, and God humiliated him by making him act like an animal for, let's just say, 7 years, and he repented of that, and then God restored his kingdom to him. If God took the greatest man in the whole world and brought him to his knees, by comparison, you're a joke of a king, and you just blasphemed Yahweh. What do you think he's going to do to you? That's what he's going to say through this little discourse here. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind as we read it. So it says, verse 18. O king, the most high God, gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory, and honor. So everything that Nebuchadnezzar had, it came from Yahweh. Your gods didn't have anything to do with it. You guys were celebrating these other fake nonsense gods earlier tonight, drinking from these vessels and, singing praises to Baal and Marduk and Nabu and all these characters that are irrelevant. Yahweh is the one who gave Nebuchadnezzar everything, and you saw it happen. You were alive when this happened. You were living in the city. You saw Nebuchadnezzar act like a donkey or ox or whatever it was. You saw God finally give him back his kingdom when he finally repented and acknowledged Yahweh was the only God. You saw all this happen, and yet you blasphemed Yahweh tonight. So what do you think is going to happen to you? And you did not acknowledge that all this that you had was from Yahweh too. So verse 19, and because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed, which he did. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in, keyword, pride. This is the whole problem of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, all these guys, is pride. He was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from sons of men. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. So you saw all this happen, and you ignored it, all of it. And so as we look around our world today, what do our leaders do? All of them. You think any of them are in our worship service tonight? Anywhere in the whole country? I guarantee you probably not. Or around the world for that matter, not just our country. I know that was the last bell, so I'll stop. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Okay, I'll see you guys next week.